Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Child 44 by Tom Rob Smith. 3 months later. Southeastern Rostov Oblast, the Sea of Azov. 4 July. Nesterov sat with his toes buried in the sand. This stench of beach was popular with people living in the nearby city of Rostov-on-Don, some 40 or so kilometers to the northeast. Today was no exception. The beach was crowded, as if the inhabitants of the town had emerged from hibernation. Their bodies were drained of color by the long winter. Could he guess what kind of jobs people held from the shapes of their bodies? The fatter men were important in some way. Perhaps they were factory managers or party officials or high-ranking state security officers. Not the kind who kicked down doors, but the kind who signed forms. Nesterov was careful not to catch their eye. He concentrated on his family. His 2 sons were playing in the shallow water. His wife lay beside him, sleeping on her side, her eyes closed, her hands tucked under her head. At a glance they seemed content. A perfect Soviet family. They had every reason to be relaxed. They were on holiday, allowed the use of an official militia car, with a state voucher for fuel as a reward for the successful, discreet, and efficient handling of the 2 separate murder investigations. He'd been told to take it easy. Those had been his orders. He repeated the words in his head, sucking on their irony. The trial of Varlam Babinich had lasted 2 days, with his defense lawyer entering a plea of insanity. According to procedure, the defense were forced to rely upon the testimony of the same experts used by the prosecution. They couldn't call their own independent witnesses. Nesterov was no lawyer and didn't need to be in order to understand the enormous advantage this setup handed to the prosecution. In Babinich's case, the defense had to prove insanity without being able to call a witness who hadn't first been groomed by the prosecution. Since there were no psychiatrists working at Hospital 379, a doctor with no specialist training had been selected by the prosecution and called to make a judgment. This doctor had stated that he believed Varlam Babinich understood the difference between right and wrong and knew murder was wrong. The defendant's intelligence was limited certainly, but sufficient to grasp concepts such as criminality. After all, he'd said upon arrest, "I'm in so much trouble." The defense then had no choice but to call the same doctor and attempt to argue a contradictory point of view. Varlam Babinich had been found guilty. Nesterov had received a typed letter confirming that the 17-year-old had died on his knees, shot in the back of the head. Dr. Tyapkin's case had taken less time. Barely a day. His wife had testified that he was violent, describing his sick fantasies and claiming that the only reason she hadn't come forward before was because she'd feared for her own life and for the life of her baby. She'd also told the judge that she renounced her religion, Judaism. She would bring her children up to be loyal communists. In exchange for this testimony, she'd been transferred to Shakity, a town in the Ukraine, where she could continue her life without the stigma of her husband's crime. Since no one outside Voualsk had heard of the crime, there wasn't even any need to change her name. With these two cases concluded, the court had processed close to 200 cases against men accused of anti-Soviet behavior. These homosexuals had received hard labor sentences of between 5 and 25 years. In order to deal with the sheer number of cases swiftly, the judge had devised a formula for sentencing which depended upon their employment record, the number of children they had, and finally, the quantity of perverse sexual encounters they'd been alleged to have experienced. Being a member of the party was counted as a strike against the accused, since they'd brought the party into disrepute. They should have known better, and their membership was stripped from them. Despite the repetitious nature of these sessions, Nesterov had sat through all of them. All 150 or so. After the last man had been sentenced, he'd left the court only to find himself being congratulated by local party officials. He'd done well. It was almost certain he'd have a new apartment within the next couple of months. Or if not then, by the end of the year. Several nights after the conclusion of the trials, as he'd lain awake, his wife had told him it was only a matter of time before he agreed to help Leo. She wished he'd just get on and do it. Had he been waiting for her permission? Perhaps he had. He was gambling with not only his own life, but with those of his family. It wasn't that he was doing anything technically wrong by asking questions and making inquiries, but he was acting on his own. Independent action was always a risk, since it implied that the structures put in place by the state had failed. That the individual could somehow achieve something the state could not. All the same, he was confident that he could begin a quiet kind of investigation, a casual investigation, which would appear to be no more than conversations between colleagues. If he discovered that there were no similar cases, no other murdered children, then he could be sure that the brutal punishments he'd been instrumental in bringing about had been fair, just, and appropriate. Though he mistrusted Leo and resented the doubt he'd stirred up, there was no escaping that the man had posited. There was no escaping that the man had posited a very simple question. Did his work have meaning, or was it merely a means to survive? There was nothing shameful about trying to survive. It was the occupation of the majority. However, was it enough to live in squalor and not even be rewarded with a sense of pride, not even to be sustained by a sense that what he did served some purpose? For the past 10 weeks, Nesterov had operated on his own without any discussion or collaboration with Leo. Since Leo was almost certainly under surveillance, the less contact between them, the better. All he'd done was to scribble Leo a short note. "I'll help," including instructions to destroy the note immediately. There was no easy way of accessing regional criminal files. He'd made phone calls and written letters. In both forms of communication, he'd mentioned the subject only in passing. praising the efficiency of his department with the swift resolution of their 2 cases in an attempt to provoke similar boasts. As the replies began to arrive, he'd been forced to make several off-duty train journeys, arriving in towns and meeting with his colleagues, drinking with them, discussing relevant cases for no more than a fraction of a minute before boasting about other things. It was an extraordinarily inefficient means of collecting information. 3 hours of drinking might provide 2 minutes of useful conversation. After 8 weeks, Nesterov hadn't unearthed a single unsolved crime. At this point, he'd called Leo into his office. Leo had entered the office, shut the door, and sat down. Nesterov had double-checked the corridors before returning, locking the office door and reaching under his desk. He'd taken out a map of the Soviet Union, which he'd spread across the desk, weighing down the corners with books. He then picked up a handful of pins. He'd stuck 2 into the map at Voualsk, 2 in Molotov, 2 in Vyatka, 2 in Gorky, and 2 in Kazan. These pins formed a row of towns which followed the train line west towards Moscow. Nesterov hadn't been to Moscow, deliberately avoiding its militia officers, who he'd feared were likely to be suspicious of any inquiries. West of Moscow, Nesterov had been less successful in gathering information, but he'd found one possible incident in Tver. Moving south, he stuck 3 pins in the city of Tula, 2 in the town of Orel, and 2 in Belgorod. Now into the Ukraine. He picked up the box of pins, shaking at least 20 into his hand. He continued. 3 pins in the towns of Kharkov and Gorlovka, 4 in the city of Zaporozhye, 3 in the town of Kramatorsk, and 1 in Kiev. Moving out of the Ukraine, there were 5 pins in Taganrog, and finally 6 pins in and around the city of Rostov. Nesterov had understood Leo's reaction. Stunned silence. In many ways, he had collected this information in a comparable frame of mind. At first, he tried to dismiss the similarities. The ground-up material stuffed into the children's mouths, whether officers called it soil or dirt, the mutilated torsos. But the points of similarity were too striking. There was the string around the ankles. The bodies were always naked. The clothes left in a pile some distance away. The crime scenes were in forests or parks and often near train stations. Never household crimes, never interior. Not one town had spoken to another, even though some crimes had occurred less than 50 kilometers apart. No connecting line had been traced, joining up these pins. They'd been solved by blaming drunks, or thieves, or convicted rapists, undesirables, to whom any allegation would stick. By his count, there were 43 in total. Nesterov had reached over, taken another pin from the box, and stuck it into the center of Moscow, making Arkady, child 44. Nesterov awoke to find the side of his face pressed against the sand, his mouth open. He sat up, brushing the sand off. The sun had disappeared behind the sheet of cloud. He looked for his children, searching the stretch of beach, the people playing. His eldest son, Efim, 7 years old, sat near the water's edge. But his youngest son, only 5 years old, was nowhere to be seen. Nestorov turned to his wife. She was cutting slices of dried meat, ready for their lunch. "Where's Vadim?" Inessa looked up, her eyes immediately finding their eldest son, but not their youngest. Still holding the knife, she got up, turning around, checking behind her. Unable to see him, she dropped the knife. They both moved forward, arriving by Efim, kneeling down beside him, one on either side. "Where's your brother?" "He said he was going back to you." "When?" "I don't know." "Think." "Not long ago. I'm not sure." "We told you to stay together." "He said he was going back to you." "He didn't go out into the water." "He went that way, towards you." Nestorov stood again, staring into the water. Vadim hadn't gone out into the sea. He hadn't wanted to swim. He was on the beach, somewhere amongst these hundreds of people. Images from the case files rose into his mind. One young girl had been murdered off a popular riverside trail. Another young girl had been murdered in a park behind a monument 100 yards from her house. He crouched beside his son. "Go back to the blankets. Stay there no matter who talks to you, no matter what they say. Even if they're your elders and demand your respect, you remain in the same place." Remembering how many children had been persuaded into disappearing into the forest, he changed his mind, taking his son's hand. "Come with me. We'll both look for your brother." His wife went up the beach in the opposite direction, while Nestorov walked down, weaving in and out of people, walking at a brisk pace, too quick for Efim, so he picked his son up, carrying him. The beach came to an end, tapering off into long grass and reeds. Vadim was nowhere to be seen. Efim knew a little about his father's work. He knew about the 2 murdered children in his hometown because his parents had spoken to him about them, although they'd made him swear not to mention the murders to anyone. No one was supposed to be worried about them. They were meant to be solved. Efim knew his little brother was in danger. He was a talkative, friendly boy. He'd find it difficult to be rude to anyone. Efim should have kept a better watch on him, and realizing he was to blame, he began to cry. At the other end of the beach, Inessa called for her son. She'd read the documents pertaining to her husband's investigation. She knew exactly what had happened to these missing children. Panicking, she blamed herself entirely. She told her husband to help Leo. She'd encouraged him, advising on basic precautions to keep the investigation a secret. He was by nature blunt, and this work needed caution. She'd read his letters before they were posted, suggesting the insertion of certain phrases should the letters be intercepted. When he'd shown her the map marked with pins, she touched each pin individually. It was an impossible number, and that night she'd slept in the same bed as her sons. Tying their holiday into the investigation had been her idea. Since the greatest concentration of murders had taken place in the south of the country, the only way Nestorov could make a substantial expedition unnoticed would be to use his family holiday as a cover. Only now did she fully understand that she'd put her children in danger. She'd taken them into the heartland of this mysterious evil. She'd underestimated the power of this thing they were searching for. No child was safe. They were seemingly taken at will, murdered only meters from their homes. Now, It had taken her youngest son. Short of breath, shouting for her son, calling his name into the face of the bathers. Her eyes filled with tears. People circled her with their dumb, unconcerned eyes. She begged them to help her. "He's only 5 years old. He's been taken. We have to find him." A stern-looking woman tried to take hold of her. "He'll be here somewhere. You don't understand. He's in terrible danger." "From what?" She pushed the woman out of the way, turning around and around, calling his name. Suddenly she felt a man's strong hands on her arms. "My little boy's been taken. Please help me look for him." "Why don't you calm down?" "No, he'll be killed. He'll be murdered. You have to help me find him." The man laughed. "No one is going to be killed. He's quite safe." She began to struggle, but the man wouldn't let her go. Surrounded by pitying faces, she tried to break free. "Let go of me! I need to find my son!" Nesterov pushed through the crowd, breaking through to his wife. He'd found his youngest son playing in the tall reeds and was now carrying both his children. The man let go of his Inesa's arm. She took hold of Vadim, clutching his head as though it were fragile and might break. They stood together as a family, surrounded, hostile faces all around. Why had they behaved like that? What was wrong with them? Efim whispered, "Let's go." They left the crowd, hurriedly collecting their stuff and heading to the car. There were only 4 other cars parked by the dirt road. The rest of the bathers had arrived by tram. Nesterov started the engine, driving off. On the beach, a thin woman with a touch of grey in her hair watched as the car disappeared. She'd made a note of the number plate, having decided this was a family that needed investigating. Moscow, 5 July. Until yesterday, if Leo had been arrested, there was nothing directly linking Raiza to his unauthorized investigation. She could have denounced him, and there might have been a chance she'd survive. That was no longer true. On a train nearing Moscow, traveling under false papers, their guilt was indivisible. Why had Raiza boarded the train, accompanying Leo? It went against her governing principle, survival. She was accepting an immeasurable risk when an alternative presented itself to her. She could have stayed in Voualsk and done nothing, or, to be safer still, she could have betrayed Leo and hoped that this betrayal would have secured her future. It was an unpleasant strategy, hypocritical and despicable, but she'd done many unpleasant things in the name of survival, including marrying Leo, a man she'd loathed. What had changed? This wasn't about love. Leo was now her partner, not in the straightforward marital sense. They were partners in this investigation. He trusted her, listened to her, not as a courtesy, but as an equal. They were a team, sharing a common goal, united behind a purpose more important than either of their lives. Energized, excited, she didn't want to return to her former substance. She didn't want to return to her former subsistence existence, wondering how much of her soul she'd have to slice off and sell in order to survive. The train came to a stop at Yaroslavavsky, Vokzal. Leo was all too aware of the significance of returning here, traveling across the very train tracks where Arkadiy's body had been found. They were returning to Moscow for the first time since their exile 4 months ago. They had no official business here. Their lives and investigation depended on being undiscovered. If they were caught, they would die. The reason for their venture was a woman called Galina Shaporina, a woman who'd seen the killer, an eyewitness who could describe this man, put an age on him, flesh him out, make him real. Currently, neither Leo nor Raiza had any idea of what kind of man they were searching for. They were clueless as to whether he was old or young, lean or heavy, scruffy or well-dressed. In short, he could be almost anyone. In addition to speaking to Galina, Raiza had proposed talking to Ivan, her colleague from school. He was well read in censored Western material and had access to restricted publications, magazine articles, newspapers, and unauthorized translations. He might be aware of case studies about comparable crimes from abroad, random, multiple, ritualized murders. Raiza knew only about such crimes in the barest of detail. She'd heard about an American, Albert Fish, who'd murdered children and eaten them. She'd heard stories about a Frenchman, Dr. Petois, who, during the Great Patriotic War, had lured Jews to his cellar offering safety, and then killed them, burning their bodies. She had no idea whether this was merely Soviet propaganda about the decay of Western civilization. Killers depicted as products of a flawed society and perverse politics. From the point of view of their investigation, a determinist theory was useless. It meant that the only suspect they could be looking for was a foreigner, someone whose character had been determined by living in a capitalist society. But clearly, the killer was moving around the country with ease. He spoke Russian and charmed the children. This was a killer operating within the fabric of their country. Everything they knew or had been told about this type of crime was either false or irrelevant. They had to unlearn every presumption and start afresh. And Raiza believed that Ivan's access to sensitive information was crucial to re-educating themselves. Leo appreciated that such material would be of benefit, but equally he was also keen to reduce their interaction to as few people as possible. Their primary objective was speaking to Galina Shaporina. Ivan was secondary. Leo wasn't entirely convinced that he was worth the risk. However, he was aware that his evaluation was tainted by personal factors. Was he jealous of Ivan's relationship with his wife? Yes, he was. Did he want to share their investigation with Ivan? Not for a second. Leo glanced out of the window, waiting for everyone to disembark. Train stations were patrolled by undercover and uniformed agents. All major transport junctions were deemed to be vulnerable as points of infiltration. There were armed checkpoints on the roads. Ports and harbors were under constant surveillance. Nowhere was layered in more levels of protection than Moscow. They were attempting to sneak into the most heavily policed city in the country. Their only advantage was that Vasily had little reason to suppose they'd be reckless enough to embark on such a venture. About to step off the train, Leo turned to Raiza. If you happen to catch their eye, a guard or anyone else, even someone who appears to be a civilian, don't immediately look away. Don't smile or make any gestures. Just hold eye contact and then look at something else. They stepped down onto the platform, neither of them carrying much luggage. Large bags were more likely to draw attention. Walking briskly, they had to stop themselves from rushing. Leo was thankful that the station was busy. All the same, he could feel his shirt collar becoming damp with sweat. He tried to reassure himself that there was almost no chance any of the agents here were looking for them. They'd already been careful to shake any possible surveillance back at Voualsk. They'd established that they were going on a walking holiday in the mountains. Applications had to be made for vacations. Because of their limited status, they'd only been able to get a couple of days. Under extreme time pressure, they'd set off into the forest, trekking in a loop, making sure they weren't being followed. Once they were confident they were alone, they'd return to the forest near the station. They changed out of their muddy clothes, buried them and their camping equipment, and sat waiting for the train to Moscow to arrive. They boarded it at the last minute. Should all go according to plan, they'd collect the eyewitness report, return to Voualsk, slip into the forest, retrieve their equipment and change back into their muddy clothes. They'd re-enter the town from one of the northern forest trails. They were almost at the exit when a man behind them called out, "Papers!" Without hesitating, Leo turned. He didn't smile or try to appear relaxed. The officer they were dealing with was state security, but Leo didn't recognize him. That was fortunate. He handed over his papers. Raiza handed over hers. Leo studied the man's face. He was tall, stocky. His eyes were slow, his movements sluggish. This was nothing more a routine stop and search. This was nothing more than a routine stop and search. However, routine or not, the papers he now examined were fake, and at best only a passable imitation. In his days as an agent, Leo would never have been fooled by them. Nesterov had helped provide them, doctoring them with Leo's assistance. They'd worked hard, but the more they'd worked, the more he'd become conscious of their weakness. The scratches on the paper, the points where the ink bled, the double lines where it had been stamped twice. He now wondered how he could have put his faith in these documents and realized he hadn't. He'd hoped they wouldn't be checked. Raiza watched the agent pore over the writing and realized the man could barely read. He was trying to hide this fact by pretending to be extremely thorough. But she'd seen too many children struggle with the same problem not to be able to spot the signs. The man's lips moved as his eyes scanned the lines. Aware that if she gave any indication of knowing his weakness, he'd almost certainly lash out. She maintained her look of fear. She reasoned he'd appreciate being feared. It would soothe any anxiety that he might be feeling. Sure enough, the agent checked on their expressions, not because he had some suspicion regarding the document, but because he was worried they'd become less afraid of him. Satisfied that he was still a man to be feared, he slapped the documents against the palm of his hand, making it clear that he was weighing them. Making it clear that he was weighing them up, that he still had power over their lives. "Let me see your bags." Leo and Raiza opened their small bags. They carried nothing more than a change of clothes and some basic essentials. The officer was becoming bored. He shrugged. In reply, they nodded reverentially at him. moving towards the exit, trying not to walk too fast. Same day. Having quashed Fyodor's own investigation into the murder of his son, cajoled and bullied him into silence, Leo was about to ask for his help with the same subject. He needed Fyodor to take him to Galina Shaporina's apartment, since he'd been unable to find the address. Indeed, it was possible that he couldn't even remember her name correctly. He hadn't been paying much attention at the time. He hadn't been paying much attention at the time, and so much had happened since then. Without Fyodor, there was little hope of finding this witness. Leo was prepared for humiliation, the loss of face. He was braced for scorn and contempt, just as long as he secured that eyewitness account. Although Fyodor was an MGB agent, Leo was banking on the fact that his loyalty would be to the memory of his son. No matter how much hatred Fyodor felt towards Leo, surely his desire for justice would force them into an alliance. With that said, Leo's assessment of the situation 4 months ago had been correct. An unauthorized investigation into the death of his son would put his entire family at risk. Perhaps Fyodor had come to terms with that assessment. Better to protect the living. Better to turn Leo over to the state. That way, he benefited from both safety and revenge. What would he decide? Leo knocked on the door. He was about to find out. Apartment block 18, 4th floor. An elderly woman opened the door. The woman who'd stood up to him. The woman who dared to call a murderer by its name. My name is Leo. This is my wife, Raiza. The old woman stared at Leo, remembering him, hating him. She glanced at Raiza. What do you want? Raiza answered, her voice low. We're here about the murder of Arkady. There was a long silence, the old woman studying both their faces before replying. You've come to the wrong address. No boy was murdered here. As she went to close the door, Leo put his foot forward. You were right. Leo expected anger, but instead the elderly woman began to cry. Fyodor, his wife, and the elderly woman, Fyodor's mother, stood together. A civilian troika, a citizens' tribunal, watching as Leo took off his coat, dropping it on the chair. He pulled off his jumper and began unbuttoning his shirt. Underneath, taped to his body, were the details of the murders. Photos, descriptions, statements, maps showing the geographical spread of the crimes, the most important pieces of evidence that they'd accumulated. I had to take certain precautions in carrying this material around. These are the details of over 40 murders, children, both boys and girls, murdered across the western half of our country. They've been killed in almost exactly the same way as I now believe your son was killed. Leo pulled the papers free from his chest. The ones closest to his skin were damp with sweat. Fyodor took hold of them, glancing through. His wife stepped forward, as did his mother. Soon, all three were reading the documents, passing them between each other. Fyodor's wife spoke first. And if you catch him, what will you do? Remarkably, It was the first time Leo had been asked that question. Until now, they'd concentrated on whether it was even possible to catch him. "I'll kill him." Once Leo had explained the nature of his personal investigation, Fyodor wasted no time with insults or recriminations. It evidently didn't cross his mind to refuse them assistance or doubt their sincerity or worry about the repercussions. Nor did those thoughts occur to Fyodor's wife or his mother, at least not in any significant way. Fyodor would take them to Galina's apartment immediately. The shortest route there involved crossing the railway tracks, where Arkady had been found. There were several train tracks running parallel, a wide space lined with ragged shrubs and trees. With the fading evening light, Leo appreciated the appeal of this secluded no man's land. In the heart of the city it felt eerily empty. Had the boy run across these sleepers, chased by that man? Had he fallen to the ground, desperate to get away? In the dark, had the train raced past indifferent? Leo was glad to get off the tracks. Nearing the apartment, Fyodor argued that Leo should remain outside. Galina had been terrified by him before. They couldn't risk him scaring her into silence again. Leo agreed. It would just be Raiza and Fyodor. Raiza followed Fyodor up the stairs, reaching the apartment door and knocking. She could hear the sound of children playing inside. She was pleased. Of course, she didn't believe a woman had to be a mother to appreciate the gravity of this case. But the fact that Galina's own children were in danger would make her easy to enlist. The door was opened by a gaunt woman in her 30s. She was wrapped up as though it was the middle of winter. She appeared ill. Her eyes were nervous, taking in every detail of Raiza's and Fyodor's appearance. Fyodor seemed to recognize her. "Galina, you remember me? I'm Fyodor, father of Arkady, the little boy who was murdered. This is my friend Raiza. She lives in Voualsk, a town near the Urals. Galina, the reason we're here is because the man who murdered my son is murdering other children in other towns. That is why Raiza has traveled to Moscow, so that we can work together. We need your help." Galina's voice was soft, barely a whisper. "How can I help? I don't know anything." Expecting such a reply, Raiza pointed out, "Fyodor isn't here as an officer of the MGP. We're a group made of fathers and mothers, any citizens outraged at these crimes. Your name won't appear in any documents. There are no documents. You'll never see or hear from us again. All we need to know is what he looks like. How old is he? Is he tall? What color is his hair? Were his clothes expensive or cheap?" "But the man I saw wasn't with a child. I told you that," Fyodor answered. "Please, Galina, let us in for a second. Let's talk out of the hallway." She shook her head. "I can't help you. I don't know anything." Fyodor was becoming agitated. Raiza touched his arm, silencing him. They had to remain calm. They couldn't bully her. Patience was the key. "Okay, that's okay, Galina. You didn't see a man with a child. Fyodor explained that you saw a man with a tool bag. Is that right?" She nodded. "Can you describe him for us?" "But he didn't have a child with him." "We understand. He didn't have a child with him. You've been clear about that. He just had a tool bag. But what did he look like?" Galina considered. Raiza held her breath, sensing she was about to break. They didn't need the information written down. They didn't need a signed testimony. They just needed a description. Thrown away, deniable. 30 seconds. That was all it would take. Suddenly Fyodor cut through the silence, saying, "There's no harm in telling us what a man with tool bag looked like. No one can get in trouble for describing a railway worker." Raisa stared at Fyodor. He'd made a mistake. People could get in trouble for describing a railway worker. They could get in trouble for much less. The safest course of action was always to do nothing. Galina shook her head, stepping back from them. "I'm sorry. It was dark. I didn't see him. He had a bag, that's all I remember." Fyodor put his hand on the door. "No, Galina. Please." Galina shook her head. "Leave! Please! Please!" Like a panicked animal, her voice became shrill with worry. "Leave!" There was silence. The noise of the children playing stopped. Galina's husband appeared. "What's going on?" In the corridor apartment, doors opened. People were staring, observing, pointing, alarming Galina further. Sensing that they were losing control of the situation, that they were about to lose their eyewitness, Raisa moved forward, hugging Galina as if saying goodbye. What did he look like? Cheek to cheek, Raisa waited, closing her eyes, hoping she could feel Galina's breath. But Galina did not reply. Rostov-on-Don. Rostov-on-Don. Same day. The cat perched on the window ledge, its tail flicking from side to side, its cool green eyes following Nadia around the room as if it were her, as if it were considering pouncing on her, as if she were nothing more than an oversized rat. The cat was older than her. She was 6 years old. The cat was 8 or 9. That fact might go some way to explain why it had such a superior attitude. According to her father, the area they lived in had a problem with rats, and therefore cats were essential. Well, that was partly true. Nadia had seen plenty of rats. Big rats, and bold too. But she'd never seen this cat do anything useful about them. It was a lazy cat, spoiled, rotten by her father. How could a cat think itself more important than her? It never allowed her to touch it. Once, as it had happened to pass by, she'd stroked its back, to which it had replied by twisting around, hissing, before bolting to the corner with its fur stuck out as though she'd committed some sort of crime. At that point, she'd given up trying to befriend it. If the cat wanted to hate her, she'd hate it back twice as much. Unable to remain in the house any longer, with the cat staring at her, Nadia set off, even though it was late and the rest of her family were in the kitchen, preparing uzhin. Knowing that she'd be refused permission to go for a walk, she didn't bother asking, slipping on her shoes and sneaking out of the front door. They lived on the bank of the river Don. Her younger sister, her mother and father, in a neighborhood on the outskirts. Cratered streets and brick hut houses. The city's sewage and factory waste fed into the river just upstream, and Nadia would sometimes sit and watch the patterns of oil, filth, and chemicals on the water's surface. There was a well-trodden path along the riverbank, which ran in both directions. Nadia turned downstream, out towards the countryside. Even though there was very little light, she was confident of the route. She had a good sense of direction, and as far as she could remember, she'd never been lost. Not once. She wondered what kind of jobs a girl with a good sense of direction might get when she grew up. Maybe she'd become a fighter pilot. There was no point becoming a train driver since they never had to think about where they were going. A train could hardly get lost. Her father had told her stories about female bomber pilots during the war. That sounded good to her. She wanted to be one of them. Her face on the front of a newspaper, awarded the Order of Lenin. That would get her father's attention. That would make him proud of her. That would distract him from his stupid cat. She'd been walking for a little while, humming to herself, pleased to be out of the house and away from that cat, when suddenly she came to a stop. Up ahead, she could see the outline of a man walking towards her. He was a tall man, but in the gloom, she couldn't tell much else about him. He was carrying some kind of case. Normally, the sight of a stranger wouldn't have bothered her in the least. Why would it? But her mother had recently done a peculiar thing. She'd sat Nadia and her sister down and warned them not to talk to any strangers. She'd even gone as far as telling them it would be better to be impolite than to obey a stranger's request. Nadia looked back towards her house. She wasn't all that far from home. If she ran, she could get back in less than 10 minutes. The thing was, she really wanted to walk to her favorite tree further downstream. She liked to climb up and sit in it and dream. Until she'd done that, until she'd reached that tree, she didn't feel like the walk had been a success. She imagined that this was her military mission, to reach the tree, and she couldn't fail. Making a snap decision, she decided she wouldn't talk to this man. She'd just walk straight past him, and if he spoke to her, she'd say good evening, but not stop walking. She continued along the path with the man getting nearer. Was he walking faster? He seemed to be. It was too dark to see his face. He was wearing some sort of hat. She moved up the edge of the path, giving him plenty of room to pass by. They were only a couple of meters apart. Nadia felt afraid. An inexplicable urge to hurry past him. She didn't understand why. She blamed her mother. Bomber pilots were never afraid. She broke into a run. Concerned this would insult the gentleman, she called out, "Good evening." With his free arm, Andrei grabbed her around the waist, lifting her small frame clear off the ground, bringing her face close to his, staring into her eyes. She was terrified, holding her breath, her little body rigid with tension. And then Nadia began to laugh. Recovering from her surprise, she put her arms around her father's neck and hugged him. "You scared me." "Why are you out so late?" "I wanted to walk." "Does your mother know you're outside?" "Yes." "You're lying." "No, I am not." "Why are you coming from this direction?" "You never come from this direction." "Where have you been?" "I've been working. I had some business in one of the villages just outside the city. There was no way to get back except to walk. It was only a couple of hours." "You must be tired." Yes, I am. Can I carry your case? But I'm carrying you, so even if I gave you my case, I'd still be carrying its weight. I could walk by myself and carry your case. I think I can manage. Father, I'm glad you're home. Still carrying his daughter, he used the base of his case to push open their door. He was stepped into the kitchen. There was affection from his youngest daughter, who ran over to greet him. He watched his family's pleasure at his return. They took it for granted that when he went away, he'd come back. Nadia had her eye on the cat. Evidently jealous of the attention she was getting from her father, the cat jumped down from the window, joining the family reunion, rubbing itself against her father's leg. As Andrei lowered her to the floor, she accidentally dropped her foot onto the cat's paw, causing it to screech and dart away. Before she could enjoy any small sense of satisfaction, her father took hold of her wrist, crouched down, staring at her through his thick, square glasses, his face trembling with anger. "Don't ever touch her!" Nadia wanted to cry. She bit her lip instead. She already learned that crying made no impression on her father. Andrei let go of his daughter's wrist, standing up straight. He felt flustered and hot. He looked at his wife. She hadn't moved forward, but she smiled at him. "Have you eaten?" "I have to put my things away. I don't want anything to eat." His wife didn't attempt to hug or kiss him, not in front of the children. He was strict about these things. She understood. "Was your work successful?" "They want me to go away again in a couple of days. I'm not sure for how long." Without waiting for a reply, he was already feeling claustrophobic. He moved to the door that led to the basement. The cat followed him, its tail up high, excited. He locked the door behind him, click, descending the stairs, immediately feeling better now that he was on his own. An elderly couple had previously occupied this downstairs space, but the woman had died and the man had moved into his son's apartment. The housing bureau hadn't sent another couple to replace them. It wasn't a nice room. A basement sunk into the riverbank. The bricks were always wet. In winter, the room was freezing. There was a burzuika, a wooden fire stove, which the elderly couple had been forced to keep running for 8 months of the year. Despite the basement's many disadvantages, it had one advantage. It was his space. He had a chair in one corner and a slender bed which had belonged to the elderly couple. He occasionally slept down here when the conditions were tolerable. He lit the gas lamp, and before long another cat had entered through the space in the wall where the pipes from the burzuika ran outside. He opened his case. Amongst his papers and the remains of his lunch were a glass jar with a screw-top lid. He unscrewed the lid. Inside the jar, wrapped in an old issue of Pravda, sodden with blood, was the stomach of the girl he'd murdered some hours ago. He peeled the paper away, carefully making sure no paper was stuck to the flesh. He put the stomach on a tin plate, slicing it into strips, then again into cubes. Once he'd finished, he'd fired up the stove. By the time it was hot enough to cook the meat, there were 6 cats circling him. He fried the meat, waiting till it had turned brown before tipping it back onto the tin plate. Andrei stood watching the cats around his feet, enjoying the spectacle of their hunger, holding the food, teasing them, watching them yelp. They were desperately hungry, frenzied by the smell of cooked meat. After he'd had his fill of teasing them, he put the food down. The cats squeezed together in a circle around the plate and began to eat, purring with delight. Purr, purr. Upstairs, Nadia stared at the basement door, wondering what kind of father preferred cats to children. He was only going to be home for 2 days. No, she was wrong to be angry with her father. She refused to blame him. The cats were to blame. A thought came into her mind. It wouldn't be all that difficult to kill a cat. The hard part would be getting away with it. Same day. On Vorovsky Street, Leo and Raiza joined the back of the grocery store queue. The queue would take several hours before it reached inside, where each person would place their order before being made to wait in a second queue to pay for the item. After those 2 queues, there was a third queue to collect the item. They could easily remain in these various lines for up to 4 hours, waiting inconspicuously for Ivan to come home. Having failed to persuade Galina Shapurina to speak, they were in danger of coming away from Moscow with nothing. Raiza had been pushed out of the apartment, the door shut in her face. Standing in the hallway, surrounded by staring neighbors, many of whom might be informers, there was no way they could try again. It was possible that Galina and her husband had already notified the state security forces. Leo didn't think that was likely. Galina clearly believed that doing as little as possible was the safest course of action. If she tried to inform, there was a possibility she'd be incriminating herself, drawing attention to herself. That was a small consolation. Their only achievement so far was to recruit Fyodor and his family into their investigation. Leo had instructed Fyodor to send any information he might be able to discover to Nesterov, since mail addressed to Leo was being intercepted. Even so, they were no close to identifying the kind of man they were looking for. In these circumstances, Raiza had pushed hard to speak to Ivan. What other options did they have except to leave the city empty-handed? Leo had reluctantly agreed. Raiza hadn't been able to get a message to Ivan. There was no way they could post a letter or make a call. She'd taken a calculated risk, hoping that he'd be here. But she knew he rarely left Moscow, certainly not for any length of time. He didn't holiday, had no interest in the countryside. The only reason she could think that he wouldn't be at home was if he'd been arrested. On that front, she could only hope that he was safe. Even though she was looking forward to seeing him again, she was under no illusions this was going to be an awkward encounter. She was with Leo, a man Ivan hated as he hated all officers of the MGB, a rule to which he made no exceptions. There were no good ones. However, it wasn't his dislike for Leo which worried her most. Rather, it was her affection for Ivan. Though she'd never cheated on Leo sexually, she'd cheated on him with Ivan in almost every other way, intellectually, emotionally, criticizing him behind his back. She'd struck up a friendship with a man defined by being against everything Leo had stood for. there was something awful about bringing these two men together. She wanted to tell Ivan as quickly as possible that Leo wasn't the same man and that he'd changed, that his blind faith in the state had been broken, smashed. She wanted to explain that she'd been wrong about her husband. She wanted them both to see that the differences between them were smaller than they'd ever realized. But there was little hope of that. Leo wasn't looking forward to meeting Ivan, Raisa's kindred spirit. He'd be forced to watch as the connection sparked between them, forced to see up close the kind of man Raisa would have married had she been free to choose. That still hurt him. More than his loss of status, more than his loss of faith in the state. He'd blindly believed in love. Perhaps he'd clung to the notion as a way of counteracting the nature of his work. Perhaps subconsciously he needed to believe in love as a way of humanizing himself. That would explain the extreme justifications he'd created to rationalize her coldness to him. He'd refused to contemplate the possibility that she hated him. Instead, he closed his eyes and congratulated himself on having everything. He told his parents that she was the wife he'd always dreamed of. He'd been right. That was all she'd been. A dream, a fantasy, and she'd shrewdly agreed to play along. All the time being terrified for her own safety, confiding in Ivan her true feelings. This fantasy had been shattered months ago. Yet why wouldn't the wounds heal? Why couldn't he move on as he'd moved on from his devotion to the MGB? He'd been able to swap devotion to the MGB with another cause, devotion to this investigation. But he had no one else to love. There'd never been anyone else. The truth was that he couldn't let go of the small hope, the fantastical notion that maybe, just maybe, she could love him for real. Although he was reluctant to trust his emotions, since he'd been so categorically wrong before. He felt that he and Raisa were closer than they'd ever been. Was that merely as a result of their working together? It was true they no longer kissed or had sex. Since Raisa had told him the truth about their history, it hadn't felt right. He'd been forced to accept that all their previous sexual experiences had meant nothing to her, or worse, they'd been unpleasant. Yet far from circumstance being the only thing keeping them together. You have me. I have you. Leo preferred to think that circumstance had been keeping them apart. Leo had been a symbol of the state, and one that Raisa had loathed. But now he no longer represented anything other than himself. Divested of authority and stripped out of the system, she hated. Divested of authority and stripped out of the system she so hated. They were almost at the shop door when they saw Ivan approach from the other end of the street. They didn't call out or draw attention to themselves. They didn't move from the line, watching as he entered his apartment building. Raisa was about to leave the queue when Leo touched her arm, stopping her. They were dealing with a dissident. It was possible he was under surveillance. It occurred to Leo that maybe the hollow coin had belonged to Ivan. Maybe he'd been the spy. What was it doing in amongst Raisa's clothes? Had she undressed in Ivan's apartment, picked up the coin by mistake? Leo pushed the thoughts aside, aware that his jealousy was playing tricks on him. Leo checked the street. He couldn't see any agents taking position around the apartment. There were several obvious places: the foyer to the cinema, this grocery queue, sheltered doorways. No matter how well trained the agents might be, keeping watch on the building was difficult since it was such an unnatural action, remaining stationary, alone, doing nothing at all. After several minutes, he was confident there was no one following Ivan. Without bothering to give a reason or make a pantomime of having forgotten a wallet, they left the queue exactly at the point when they were finally about to enter the shop. It was suspicious, but Leo could count on the fact that most people were smart enough to mind their own business. They entered the apartment building, walking up the stairs. Raiza knocked on the door. Footsteps could be heard inside. A voice, nervous, asked through the door. "Yes?" "Ivan, it's Raiza." A bolt was pulled back. Ivan cautiously opened the door. Upon seeing Raiza, his suspicions dropped away and he smiled. She smiled in reply. A couple of steps back, Leo watched their reunion in the gloom of the hallway. She was pleased to see him. They were easy together. Ivan opened the door, moving forward, hugging her, relieved that she was still alive. Ivan noticed Leo for the first time. His smile fell away like a picture falling off a wall. He let go of Raiza, suddenly unsure, glancing at her expression, checking that this wasn't a betrayal of some kind. Sensing his unease, she remarked, "We have a lot to explain." "Why are you here?" "It would be better to speak inside." Ivan didn't seem convinced. Raiza touched his arm. "Please, trust me." The apartment was small, well furnished, polished wood floors. There were books. At a glance, they all seemed to be authorized texts, Gorky, political tracts, Marx. The door to the bedroom was shut, and there was no bed in the main room. Leo asked, "Are we alone?" "My children are with my parents. My wife is in the hospital. She has tuberculosis." Raiza touched his arm again. "Ivan, I'm so sorry." "We thought you'd been arrested. I feared the worst." "We were lucky. We've been relocated to a town just west of the Urals." Leo refused to denounce me. Ivan couldn't keep the surprise from his face, as if such a thing were remarkable. Stung, Leo held his tongue as Ivan stared at him, evaluating. "Why did you refuse?" "She isn't a spy." "Since when has the truth stopped you?" Raiza interrupted. "Let's not get into that now." "But it matters. Are you still MGB?" "No, I was demoted to the militia." "Demoted? You escaped lightly." It was a question, accusatory. "It's only a temporary reprieve, demotion, exile, a prolonged punishment in obscurity." Seeking to comfort him, Raiza added, "We weren't followed here. We're sure of that." "You've traveled all the way to Moscow. Why?" "We need help." At this, he was puzzled. "What could I possibly help you with?" Leo took off his coat, his jumper, his shirt, retrieving the files taped to his body. He summarized the case, offering the papers to Ivan. Ivan accepted the papers but didn't look at them. Sitting down on a chair and placing the evidence on the table beside him. After a moment, he stood again, collecting a pipe, carefully filling it. "I take it the militia itself isn't investigating these murders?" "All these murders have been solved incorrectly, covered up, or blamed on the mentally ill, some political enemy, a drunk, a vagrant. No connection has been drawn between them." And you two are working together now? Raiza blushed. Yes, we're working together. You trust him? Yes, I trust him. Leo was forced to remain silent as Ivan questioned his wife, scrutinizing the integrity of their relationship in front of him. And together you plan to solve this crime? Leo answered. If the state won't, then the people will have to. Spoken like a true revolutionary. Except, Leo, you spent your entire life murdering for the state. Whether in war or peace. Whether they be Germans or Russians. Or whoever else the state tells you it hates. Now I'm supposed to believe you're bucking the official line and thinking for yourself? I don't believe it. I think this is a trap. I'm sorry, Raiza. I think he's trying to win his way back into the MGB. He's duped you, and now he wants to hand them me. He's not, Ivan. Look at the evidence. This is real, not some trick. I haven't trusted paper evidence for a long time, nor should you. I've seen one of these bodies, a young boy. His stomach cut open, his mouth filled with bark. I've seen it, Ivan. I was there. Someone did this to a child. Someone enjoyed doing this, and they're not going to stop. And they're not going to get caught by the militia. I know you have every right to be suspicious of us, but I can't prove it to you. If you can't trust me, then I'm sorry for coming here. Leo stepped forward, ready to collect up the files. Ivan put his hand on top of them. I'll take a look. Close the curtains, and both of you sit down. You're making me nervous. With the room cut off from the world outside, Leo and Raiza sat beside Ivan and narrated the specifics of the case, reciting as much information as they thought was useful. Leo summed up his own conclusions. He persuades these children to come with him. The footprints in the snow were side by side. The boy had agreed to walk into the forests. Even though this crime seems insane, an obviously insane man would ramble, make no sense. An obviously insane man would scare these children. Ivan nodded. Yes, I agree. Since it's very difficult to move about this country without a designated reason, he must have a job, one that involves travel. He must have papers, documents. He must be integrated into our society. He must be acceptable, respectable. The question we can't answer is, why does he do it? How can I catch him if I don't understand why? I have no image of him in my mind. What kind of man is he? Is he young or old? Is he rich or poor? We simply have no idea what kind of person we're looking for, beyond the basics, that he has a job and must appear on the outside at least to be sane. But that is almost everyone. Ivan was smoking his pipe, absorbing everything Leo had said. I'm afraid I cannot help you. Raiza sat forward. But you have Western articles about these kinds of crime, murders that aren't conventionally motivated. What will they tell you? I might be able to get together a couple of articles, but they wouldn't be enough to give you an image of this man. You can't build a picture of him from 2 or 3 sensational pieces of Western journalism. Leo sat back. This had been a wasted journey. More worrying than that, had they set themselves an impossible task. They were hopelessly ill-equipped both materially and intellectually to tackle these crimes. Ivan drew on his pipe, watching their reactions. However, I know a man who might be able to help. His name is Professor Zauzayes, a retired psychiatrist, a former MGB interrogator. He lost his sight. Going blind gave him a change of heart, an epiphany, just like you, Leo. He's now quite active in underground circles. You could tell him what you've told me. He might be able to help. Can we trust him? As much as you can trust anyone. What exactly can he do? You'll read him these documents, describe the photos. Perhaps he'll be able to shed some light on the kind of person who'd do this, such as his age, his background, that kind of thing. Where does he live? He won't allow you to go to his apartment. He's very cautious. He'll come here, if he'll come at all. I'll do my best to convince him, but I can make no guarantees. Raisa smiled. Thank you. Leo was pleased. An expert was certainly better than some journalistic scraps. Ivan stood up, putting his pipe down, moving to the side cabinet, the telephone. The telephone. This man had a telephone in his apartment. His tidy, well-furnished apartment. Leo took in the details of the room. Something was wrong. This was no family apartment. Why did he live in such comparative luxury? And how had he managed to escape arrest? After their exile, he should have been taken in. After all, the MGB had a file on him. Vasily had showed Leo the photos. How had he evaded the authorities? The call had been set up. Ivan was now speaking on the phone. Professor Zauzaez? Ivan Sukorov, here. I have an interesting task I need your help with. I can't speak about it on the phone. Are you free at the moment? Could you come to my apartment? Yes, immediately, if that's possible. Leo's body tensed. Why did he call him Professor, if they were so close? Why call him that unless it was for their benefit? This was wrong. Everything was wrong. Leo leapt up, his chair flying back. He was across the room before Ivan had the chance to react, grabbing the phone and twisting its cord tight around Ivan's neck. Leo was behind him now, back pressed up against the corner of the room, throttling him, tightening the cord. Ivan's legs were slipping on the polished floor. He gasped, unable to speak. Stunned, Raisa got out of her chair. Leo! Leo raised his finger, indicating that she remained silent. With the cord still wrapped around Ivan's neck, he lifted the receiver to his ear. Professor Zayuzaez. The phone went dead. They'd hung up. They were on their way. Leo, let him go! But Leo tightened the cord. Ivan's face was turning red. He's an operative. He's undercover. Look at how he lives. Look at his home. There is no Professor Zauzaez. That was his state security contact. He's on his way to arrest us. Leo, you're making a mistake. I know this man. He's a fake dissident, placed underground, flushing out other anti-authority figures, accumulating evidence against them. Leo, you're wrong. There is no professor. They're on their way. Raisa, we don't have much time. Ivan's fingers were frantically clasping at the cord. Raisa shook her head, prizing her fingers under the cord, relieving the pressure on his neck. Leo, let him go! Let him prove himself! Haven't all your friends been arrested? Everyone, except for him. That woman Zoya, where do you think the MGB got her name from? They didn't arrest her on the basis of her prayers. That was just their excuse. Unable to get free, Ivan's legs began slipping across the floor, forcing Leo to take his full weight. Leo couldn't hold him for much longer. Raisa, you never spoke to me about your friends. You never trusted me. Who do you confide in? Think! Raisa stared at Leo, then at Ivan. It was true. All her friends were dead or arrested. All except him. She shook her head, refusing to believe it. It was the paranoia of today. The paranoia created by the state that any allegation, no matter how far-fetched, was enough to kill a man. She caught sight of Ivan's hand reaching for the cabinet drawer. She let go of the cord. Leo, wait! We don't have time! Wait! She opened the drawer, rifling through. Inside was a letter opener, sharp, the item Ivan was reaching for to defend himself. She could hardly blame him for that. Behind that was a book, his copy of For Whom the Bell Tolls. Why was it not hidden? She picked it up. A sheet of paper was inside. On it was written a list of names. People the book had been loaned to. Some of the names were scored through. Her name had been scored through. On the other side of the page was a list of people he intended to loan the book to. She turned to Ivan, raising the sheet of paper to his face, her hand shaking. Was there an innocent explanation? No, she already knew there wasn't. No dissident would be foolish enough to write down a list of names. He loaned the book to incriminate. Leo was struggling to hold Ivan. Raisa, turn away. She obeyed, walking to the other side of the room, the book still in her hand, listening as Ivan's legs kicked the furniture. Same day. Since he was a state security operative, Ivan's death would immediately be categorized as murder. An outrage that must have been committed by someone opposed to the system. An anti-Soviet element. The culprit was an outsider, a non-believer, so legitimizing the launch of a comprehensive investigation. There was no need to cover it up. Fortunately for Leo and Raisa, Ivan must have had many enemies. He was a man who'd lived his life betraying intrigued citizens, attracting them with the promise of censored material as a predator might attract its prey with alluring bait. The censored material had been provided to him by the state. Before leaving the apartment, Raisa had taken the list of names, crumpling the paper into her pocket. Leo had hurriedly gathered together the case file. They had no idea how long it would take the state security to respond to Ivan's call. They'd opened the front door, running down the stairs before approximating calmness as they walked away. As they reached the end of the street, they'd glanced back. Agents were entering the doorway. Agents were entering the building. No one in Moscow had any reason to believe Leo and Raisa had returned. They wouldn't be immediate suspects. The officers in charge of the investigation, if the connection even occurred to him, would check with the MGB in Voualsk and discover that they were on a walking holiday. That excuse might hold unless a witness identified a man and a woman entering the apartment building. If that happened, then their alibi would come under closer scrutiny. But Leo knew all of these facts were of only the slightest importance. Even if there was no evidence, even if they really had been on a walking holiday, this murder could be used as a pretext to arrest them. The weight of evidence was totally irrelevant. In their current predicament, trying to see his parents was an act of sheer brazenness. But there was no train back to Voualsk until 5 in the morning. And more to the point, Leo understood this would be his last chance to speak to them. Although he'd been refused contact with them since leaving Moscow and been given no details of their whereabouts, he had acquired the address several weeks ago. Knowing that the state departments tended to operate in autonomy, In autonomy, he'd felt there was a chance that an inquiry to the Department of Housing about Stepan and Anna wouldn't be automatically flagged up and passed on to the MGP. As a precaution, he'd given a false name and tried to make his request seem as though it was official business, asking for a selection of names, including Galina Shaporina. Although all the other names had drawn a blank, he'd managed to locate his parents. Vasily might have been expecting such an attempt. Indeed, he might even have given orders for the address to be released. He knew Leo's weakness in exile would be his parents. If he wanted to catch him violating orders, then his parents were the perfect trap. But it seemed unlikely that his parents would be under permanent surveillance for as long as 4 months. More probable was that the family they were forced to share with were also doubling as informers. He had to reach his parents without the other family seeing or hearing or knowing. His parents' safety depended upon this secrecy as much as their own. If they were caught, they'd be tied to Ivan's murder and Leo's entire family would die, perhaps even before the night was over. Leo was prepared to take the risk. He had to say goodbye. They'd arrived on Ulitsa Vorontsovskaya. The house in question was an old building, pre-revolutionary, the kind that had been sliced into 100 tiny apartments, partitioned by nothing more than dirty sheets hanging off lengths of rope. There would be no amenities, no running water, no indoor toilets. Leo could see pipes jutting out of the windows to release the smoke from the wood stoves, the cheapest and dirtiest form of heating available. Surveying the property from a safe distance, they waited. Mosquitoes landed on their necks, forcing them to continually slap their skin until their hands were spotted with their own blood. Leo knew no matter how long he stood here, there was no way he could ascertain if this was a trap. He'd have to go in. He turned to Raiza. Before he could speak, she said, "I'll wait here." Raiza felt ashamed. She trusted Ivan. Her opinion of him had been based solely on the trappings of his books and papers. His musings on Western culture, his alleged plans to help key dissident writers smuggle their works out to the West. Lies. All of it. How many writers and opponents of the regime had he snared? How many manuscripts had he burned so that they were lost to the world? How many artists and free thinkers had he directed the Chekists to arrest? She'd fallen for him because of his obvious differences to Leo. The difference had been a disguise. The dissident had been the policeman, and the policeman had become the counter-revolutionary. The dissident had betrayed her. The policeman saved her. She could hardly say goodbye to Leo's parents, side by side with her husband, as though she'd been a loyal, loving wife. Leo took her hand. "I'd like you to come with me." The communal door was unlocked. The air inside was hot, stale, and they immediately began to sweat. Their clothes clung to their backs. Upstairs, apartment 27. The door was locked. Leo had broken into many properties. The older locks were normally more difficult to pick than the modern ones. Using the tip of a flick knife, he unscrewed the plate, revealing the lock mechanism. He inserted the blade, but the lock refused to open. He wiped the sweat from his face, stopping for a moment, breathing deeply, closing his eyes. He dried his hands on his trousers, ignoring the mosquitoes. Let them have their fill. He opened his eyes. Concentrate. The lock clicked open. The only light came from the window facing the street. The room stank of sleeping bodies. Leo and Raiza waited by the door, adjusting to the gloom. They could distinguish the outline of 3 beds. 2 of the beds contained adult couples. A smaller bed appeared to have 3 children sleeping in it. In the kitchen area, 2 small children slept on rugs on the floor like dogs under a table. Leo moved towards the sleeping adults. Neither of them were his parents. Had he been given the wrong address? Such incompetence was commonplace. Maybe the wrong address had been given to him deliberately. Seeing the outline of another door, he moved towards it, the floorboard straining under each step. Raiza was just behind and of much lighter tread. The couple in the nearest bed began to stir. Leo paused, waiting for them to settle down. The couple remained asleep. Leo continued, Raiza following. He reached out, taking hold of the door handle. There were no windows in this room, no light whatsoever. Leo had to keep the door open in order to see anything. He could make out that there were 2 beds, and barely a gap between them. Not even a dirty sheet partitioned them. One bed contained 2 children. In the other bed there was an adult couple. He moved closer. These were his parents, sleeping pressed against each other in a narrow single bed. Leo stood up, returning to Raiza and whispering, "Shut the door." Forced to move in total darkness, Leo felt his way along the bed until he was crouched on the floor beside his parents. He listened to them sleep. Glad it was dark, he was crying. The room they'd been forced into was smaller than the bathroom of their previous apartment. They had no space of their own and no way of cutting themselves off from this family. They'd been sent here to die in parallel to their son's intended demise. Humiliated. At exactly the same time he placed his hands over their mouths. He could feel them waking, startled, tense. To stop them from calling out, he whispered, "It's me, Leo. Don't make a noise." The tension in their bodies disappeared. He removed his hands from their mouths. He could hear them sitting up. He felt his mother's hands on his face. Blind in this darkness, she was touching him. Her fingers stopped moving when they felt his tears. He heard her voice, barely a whisper. "Leo." His father's hands joined hers. Leo pressed their hands against his face. He'd sworn to look after them, and he'd failed. All he could do was mutter, "I'm sorry." His father replied, "You've nothing to apologize for. We would have lived like this all our life had it not been for you." His mother interrupted, her mind catching up with all the questions she wanted to ask. "We thought you were dead. We were told you'd both been arrested." "They lied. We've been sent to Voualsk. I was demoted, not imprisoned. I'm now working for the militia. I wrote to you many times asking the letters be forwarded to you, but they must have been intercepted and destroyed." The children in the nearby bed stirred, their bed frame creaking. Everyone fell silent. Leo waited until he could hear the children's deep, slow breathing. "Raiza is here." He guided their hands to her. All 4 of them held hands. His mother asked, "The baby?" "No." Leo added, not wanting to complicate this reunion. Miscarriage. Raiza spoke again, her voice broken with emotion. I'm sorry. This is not your fault. Anna added, how long are you in Moscow for? Can we meet tomorrow? No, we shouldn't be here at all. If we're caught, we'll be imprisoned, and you will be too. We leave first thing in the morning. Shall we come outside so we can talk? Leo thought about this. There was no way they'd all be able to leave the apartment without waking some of the family. We can't risk waking them. We have to talk here. No one spoke for a while. 4 sets of hands clasped together in the darkness. Eventually, Leo said, I have to get you a better place to live. No, Leo, listen to me. You've often behaved as if our love was dependent on the things you could do for us, even as a child. That is not true. You must concentrate on your lives. We're old. It doesn't matter where we live anymore. The only thing that has kept us alive is waiting for some news from you. We must accept that this will be the last time we meet. We mustn't make futile plans. We must say goodbye while we have the chance. Leo, I love you and I'm proud of you. I wish you could have had a better government to serve. Anna's voice was now quite calm. You have each other. You love each other. You will have a good life. I believe that. Things will be different for you and for your children. Russia will be different. I feel very hopeful. A fantasy, but she enjoyed believing it, and Leo said nothing to contradict it. Stepan took hold of Leo's hand, placing it in an envelope. This is a letter I wrote to you many months ago. I never had the chance to give it to you because you were sent away. I didn't want to post it. Read this when you're safely on the train. Promise me not to read it earlier. Promise me. What is it? Your mother and I considered very carefully the contents of this letter. It contains everything we wanted to say to you, but were unable to for one reason or another. It contains all the things we should have spoken about a long time ago. Father, take it, Leo. For us. Leo accepted the letter, and in the darkness, the 4 of them hugged for the last time. 6 July. Leo approached the train, Raiza beside him. Were there more officers than usual on the platform? Was it possible they were already looking for them? Raiza was walking too fast. He took hold of her hand, briefly, and she slowed. The letter written by his parents had been stashed with the case file attached to his chest. They were almost at their carriage. They boarded the crowded train. Leo whispered to Raiza, "Stay here." She nodded. He entered the cramped toilet, locking the door behind him, dropping the toilet lid to reduce the smell. Taking off his jacket, unbuttoning his shirt, he removed the thin cotton bag he'd stitched to hold the case file. It was soaked with sweat, and the ink from the typed documents had made an impression on his skin, writing printed across his chest. He found the letter, turning it over in his hand. No name on the envelope. It was crumpled, dirty. He wondered how his parents had managed to keep it a secret from the other family, who inevitably would have searched through their belongings. One of them must have kept the letter on their person at all the times. One of them must have kept the letter on their person at all the times, morning and night. The train began to move, leaving Moscow. He'd kept his promise. He was now allowed to read it. He waited until they'd left the station before opening the envelope and unfolding the letter. It was his father's handwriting. Leo, neither your mother nor I have any regrets. We love you. We always expected there would come a day when we'd talk to you about this matter. To our surprise, that day never came. We thought you would raise it when you were ready, but you never did. You've always acted as though it never happened. Perhaps it was easier to teach yourself to forget. This is why we said nothing. We thought this was your way of dealing with the past. We were afraid that you'd blanked it out and that bringing it up again would only cause hurt and pain. In short, we were happy together, and we didn't want to ruin that. That was cowardly of us. I say once again, both I and your mother love you very much, and neither of us have any regrets. Leo. Leo stopped reading, turning his head away. Yes, he remembered what had happened. He knew what the letter would go on to say. And yes, he'd spent his whole life trying to forget. He folded the letter before carefully ripping it into small pieces. He stood up, opening the small window, throwing the fragments out. Caught in the wind, the uneven squares of paper rose up into the air and disappeared out of view.